The frost had settled over the Han estate before dawn, coating the garden hedges in a thin silver crust that caught the first gray light of morning like scattered glass. Tessa Whitfield moved through the east corridor with a stack of fresh linens balanced against one hip, her breath fogging faintly in the unheated hallway despite the mansion's size and wealth. She was 22 years old, new enough to this house that she still flinched slightly at the sound of the security gates closing each night, though she had learned quickly not to let that flinch show on her face where anyone might notice it. She had taken the position 3 months earlier, after the placement agency assured her the work would be straightforward. Housekeeping for a private household in the hills above the city, they had said, generous pay, discretion required, minimal contact with the family. They had not mentioned, because they likely did not know themselves, that the family in question was the Han organization, one of the most feared names in the entire peninsula's underworld, or that the man who owned this house moved through it with a kind of stillness that made grown security guards straighten their spines when he entered a room. Tessa had learned who Han Ji-hoon truly was the way most of the staff did, gradually through the things nobody said directly. The way deliveries arrived at odd hours under heavy escort. The way certain rooms in the East Wing remained permanently locked, and the staff who cleaned near them were rotated, so that no one grew too familiar with what lay behind those doors. The way Ji-hoon himself moved through his own home like a man perpetually listening for a sound only he could hear, controlled in every gesture, silent in a way that felt less like shyness and more like a held breath that never quite released. She had spoken to him directly exactly 4 times in 3 months. Each conversation had lasted under a minute. He was polite in the clipped, economical way of men who did not waste words on people they considered beneath their notice, though something in the way his eyes tracked her when she moved through a room told her he noticed considerably more than his silence suggested. This particular morning, the cold had settled deep enough that the garden beyond the kitchen window looked less like a living space and more like a photograph of one, frozen and still, the koi pond skinned over with a delicate lattice of ice. Tessa set down her linens in the servants' hallway and glanced through the window out of habit, the way she always did before beginning her rounds, cataloging the grounds the way she cataloged everything, out of an old instinct toward vigilance she had never quite managed to unlearn. That was when she saw him. Han Ji-hoon sat beneath the old cherry tree near the garden's western wall, motionless, his head tilted back against the trunk, eyes closed, dressed only in a charcoal cardigan over a white shirt, no coat, no gloves, nothing to protect him from a morning cold enough to numb exposed skin within minutes. Tessa stood frozen at the window for a full 3 seconds, her mind working through the wrongness of the scene before her feet had even decided to move. The Han estate employed no fewer than 6 security personnel visible from any given window. None of them were near him. None of them, apparently, had noticed their employer sitting outside in freezing temperatures with no protection at all. She did not stop to think about propriety, or about the strict, unspoken rule that staff did not approach Mr. Han unless summoned. She grabbed the folded wool blanket kept by the kitchen door for exactly this kind of emergency, the fire drill blanket nobody had ever actually used, and moved through the side door into the garden before her better judgment could catch up to her feet. The cold hit her like a wall the moment she stepped outside, air so sharp it felt solid in her lungs, and she crossed the frozen grass quickly, her shoes crunching against the icy blades with a sound that seemed enormous in the silent garden. She reached him and knelt, careful, hesitant despite her urgency, unsure whether waking a sleeping Mafia boss abruptly was a mistake that might cost her considerably more than her job. She settled instead for draping the blanket carefully over his legs, tucking the edges beneath his knees with the same careful attention she gave to every task in this house, though her hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or from proximity to a man whose reputation preceded him into every room, she could not entirely say. "You'll catch your death out here," she murmured, more to herself than to him, believing him still asleep. His eyes opened. Tessa froze, her hand still resting against the edge of the blanket, caught in the act of an intimacy she had not been given permission to offer. Han Ji-hoon looked at her with none of the disorientation of a man freshly woken, his gaze immediately clear, immediately focused, the particular alertness of someone who had never actually been asleep at all. You are not sleeping, she said slowly, understanding arriving a half-second before she wanted it to. No, he said. His voice was quiet, unhurried, each word placed with the same deliberate precision she had noticed in the handful of times he had spoken to her before. I was not. Tessa sat back on her heels, the blanket still tucked around his legs, embarrassment and something closer to indignation rising in equal measure. You are testing something, she said. Sitting out here in the cold, pretending to sleep. Testing what, exactly? Whether anyone in this house still sees me as a person, Han Ji-hoon said, rather than simply the name attached to their paycheck. The admission landed with an unexpected weight, quiet and unguarded in a way she suspected he rarely allowed himself to be. Tessa studied him for a long moment, the frost gathering faintly in his dark hair, his jaw set in the particular stillness of a man accustomed to revealing nothing by accident. And did I pass, she asked, or fail, by covering a sleeping man with a blanket he apparently didn't need? Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, though closer to one than she had ever seen him offer anyone in this house. You did not know I was awake, he said. You covered a stranger's legs against the cold, expecting nothing in return. That is not a test most people pass, Miss Whitfield. The use of her surname startled her slightly, evidence that he had known it all along despite their handful of clipped, forgettable exchanges. Most of the staff would have done the same, she said, though she suspected, even as she said it, that the claim was not entirely true. Most of the staff, Han Ji-hoon said, would have called security or woken me formally, or done nothing at all rather than risk overstepping. You did neither. You simply solved the immediate problem in front of you. That is a rarer instinct than you seem to understand. Tessa rose to her feet, brushing frost from her knees, suddenly aware of how strange this entire exchange had become, kneeling in a frozen garden before dawn, trading observations with a man whose organization controlled more of the city's underground economy than she wanted to think too closely about. I should get back inside, she said. There's work waiting, and you should be inside too, before you actually do catch something. In a moment, he said, and made no move to rise, studying her instead with an attention that felt entirely different from the distracted courtesy he had shown her in their previous encounters. Sit with me first. It was not quite a request, though it was not quite in order either, something in between that left her uncertain how to refuse it even if she had wanted to. She hesitated, glancing back toward the house, toward the kitchen window where, she was fairly certain, at least one member of the household staff was currently watching this entire exchange unfold with considerable interest. I don't think that would be appropriate, she said carefully. Appropriate, Han Ji-hoon repeated, as though testing the word for its usefulness. I have found over the years that appropriate is a word people use when they mean afraid, without wanting to admit to the fear directly. Which is it, Miss Whitfield? The directness of the question caught her off guard, and she found herself answering honestly before she had fully decided to. Both probably, she said. I know who you are, Mr. Han. I know what this house is, beneath the marble floors and the koi pond. I'd be foolish not to be careful. Careful, he said, is not the same as afraid. I would not have offered the seed if I intended you harm for accepting it. She sat, finally, lowering herself onto the frozen bench opposite him, close enough that she could see, for the first time at this proximity, the faint white scar tracing along the edge of his jaw, nearly invisible unless the light caught it directly, and the particular color of his eyes, dark, but not flat the way she had assumed from a distance, closer to a deep, watchful brown that seemed to catalog everything it touched. Why does it matter to you, she asked, whether the staff sees you as a person? You have more power in this city than most people will ever hold in their lives. I'd think that would matter more than being liked. Power, Han Ji-hoon said, is not difficult to acquire if you are willing to pay its price. Being seen clearly by another human being, without fear distorting what they see, is considerably harder to come by. I have very little of that in my life, Miss Whitfield. I had begun to wonder if it was possible to have any of it at all, in a house full of people paid to be careful around me. The confession sat between them, unexpectedly intimate in the frozen quiet of the garden, and Tessa felt something shift in her understanding of the man across from her, a fracture in the careful, distant portrait she had built of him over 3 months of clipped exchanges and rumor filtered through the rest of the staff. "You could ask them," she said, directly, instead of testing them with elaborate fake naps in the snow. For the first time since she had met him, Han Ji-hoon laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch him as off guard as it caught her. "A fair criticism," he said, "though I suspect a direct question would only produce the answer people believed I wanted to hear. The blanket you laid across my legs a few minutes ago was more honest than any answer a direct question could have purchased." Tessa considered that, turning the logic over in her mind, and found, somewhat unwillingly, that she could not entirely argue with it. "Well," she said, "test passed, I suppose. Though I'd rather you not repeat it. My heart nearly stopped when I thought you'd frozen to death under a tree." "Duly noted," Han Ji-hoon said, something warmer than she expected threading through the words. "I will find a less alarming method of testing sincerity in the future." They sat together a moment longer in the cold, neither of them speaking, the silence between them settling into something that did not feel entirely uncomfortable despite everything that separated their two positions in this house. Eventually he rose, gathering the blanket from his legs and folding it with careful precision before handing it back to her. "Thank you," he said, "for the blanket. And for the honesty." "You're welcome," Tessa said, taking it from him, careful again not to let their fingers brush, though she felt the deliberate care in his own movement, the same careful avoidance she was practicing herself. "Try not to freeze yourself for research purposes again, Mr. Han Ji-hoon," he said. "If we're going to continue having conversations this honest, you may as well use the name that belongs to the man." She did not answer that, uncertain what accepting the offer might mean, and instead turned back toward the house, the blanket bundled under one arm, aware of his eyes following her the entire distance across the frozen grass. It became, over the following weeks, a quiet and unspoken pattern between them. Small moments, easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. He began appearing in the kitchen doorway at odd hours, ostensibly for tea, though he lingered longer than the tea required. She began noticing things about the household that had nothing to do with her actual duties, the way certain deliveries arrived flanked by more security than others, the way one of his lieutenants, a broad-shouldered man named Choi Dae-hyun, seemed to watch her with an attention that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with suspicion. She mentioned this, eventually, to Ji-hoon directly, catching him alone in the garden on another cold morning, though this time without any pretense of sleep between them. "Your man Choi watches me like I'm a problem waiting to happen," she said. "Should I be worried about that?" Something tightened faintly at the corner of Ji-hoon's jaw, a controlled flicker of something closer to anger than she had seen from him before. "Choi Dae-hyun watches everyone in this house with suspicion," he said. "It is, unfortunately, part of his function. But if his attention toward you has become something beyond professional caution, tell me immediately. I will handle it." "Handle it how?" Tessa asked, though something in his tone told her she did not entirely want the specifics of that answer. "However is necessary," Ji-hoon said, and did not elaborate further, though the flatness in his voice told her the ambiguity was deliberate, a boundary he did not intend to cross into detail with her. Not yet. It was on one such evening, nearly a month into this quiet, unspoken rhythm between them, that Ji-hoon told her about Yoon Seo-yeon. They were sitting in the small library off the east corridor, a room Tessa had only ever dusted before, never lingered in, while Ji-hoon turned a glass of amber liquid slowly between his fingers without drinking from it. "You asked me once," he said, "why it mattered whether the staff saw me as a person rather than simply a name attached to danger. I gave you an incomplete answer that morning." Tessa set down the book she had been pretending to read and waited, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment to fill with unnecessary words. "Seo-yeon worked for my organization 8 years ago," he said. "Not in this house. In the finance division, auditing the money that moved through our shipping contracts. She was sharp in a way most of the people around me were not, unafraid to disagree with me when the numbers told a different story than the one I wanted to hear. I valued that in her before I understood I had begun to value her for entirely different reasons as well." He paused, and Tessa watched something pass behind his dark eyes, old grief resurfacing with the particular weight of a wound that had never properly closed. A rival organization discovered our involvement before I was prepared to protect her properly, he continued. They did not target her because she mattered to them directly. She mattered to them only because she mattered to me, and hurting her cost them nothing while costing me everything. She died in a car explosion meant to send a message. I received that message very clearly, Tessa. I understood, from that day forward, that anyone who came close enough to matter to me became a liability the moment my enemies learned of it. That's why you keep everyone at a distance, Tessa said quietly. Not because you don't feel anything. Because feeling it puts them in danger. Yes, Ji-hoon said. For 8 years, distance has been the only kindness I knew how to offer anyone who worked in this house. And then you covered a stranger's legs with a blanket in the freezing cold, expecting nothing in return, and I found I no longer wanted to offer you that particular kindness at all. The confession sat between them, dangerous and unfinished in the quiet library, and Tessa felt the full weight of what he was telling her, not simply grief for a woman lost, but a warning, however gently delivered, about what proximity to him might eventually cost her too. I'm not afraid of that risk, she said, surprising herself with how certain the words came out. I've spent my whole life in rooms where the safe choice was to look away from things that mattered. I don't intend to start looking away now. Something shifted in his expression, gratitude and worry tangled together in equal measure. I hope you understand what you are choosing, he said. Because I no longer have the strength to choose distance from you, even knowing what it might cost either of us. The days that followed carried a new charge between them, quieter than before but unmistakably present, a current neither of them named aloud but both of them felt in the smallest interactions. He began finding reasons to walk the same corridors she cleaned in the mornings. She began lingering longer than her duties required whenever their paths crossed, aware that something fundamental between them had shifted the night he spoke Seo-yun's name aloud for the first time in years. It was during one of these quiet mornings, barely a week later, that the household's ordinary rhythm cracked open entirely, and the danger Ji-hoon had warned her about arrived far sooner than either of them expected. The threat, when it finally arrived in earnest, came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. It was a Tuesday evening, the household settling into its usual quiet rhythm, when Tessa found herself walking the east corridor near one of the perpetually locked rooms, drawn by a sound she could not immediately place, a low murmur of voices that did not belong to any of the household staff she recognized. She should have turned back immediately. She understood that clearly, even as her feet carried her closer to the sound instead, some old instinct toward vigilance refusing to let an anomaly pass unexamined. Through the narrow gap of a door left carelessly ajar, she saw Choi Dae-hyun speaking in low, urgent tones to a man she did not recognize, someone dressed in a delivery uniform that did not match any of the estate's usual contractors. Before the handover next week, Choi was saying, his voice tight with barely contained urgency. He cannot know the shipment was compromised until it is too late to reroute it. Tessa's blood went cold, colder than the frozen garden had ever managed. She understood enough, from 3 months of careful observation and rumor absorbed sideways from the rest of the staff, to recognize betrayal when she overheard it. Choi Dae-hyun, Ji-hoon's own lieutenant, was compromising something, deliberately, behind his employer's back. She did not have time to process the full weight of what she had overheard before a floorboard shifted beneath her own foot, the small, betraying creak of old wood, and Choi's head snapped toward the door. She ran. She did not think about where, only that staying meant being found, and being found meant becoming a liability to a man who had just revealed himself capable of betraying the most dangerous man in the city, without visible hesitation. She reached the main corridor breathless, her heart slamming against her ribs, and nearly collided directly into Ji-hoon himself, emerging from his study with a particular stillness that told her, immediately, he had already sensed something was wrong before she said a single word. Tessa, he said, using her given name for the first time since the garden. What happened? Choi, she said, the word coming out in a rush between ragged breaths. He's compromising a shipment. Something about a handover next week. He was talking to someone who isn't part of your organization in the locked room in the East Wing. Ji-hoon's expression did not change, not visibly, though something in the air around him shifted immediately, a controlled and lethal stillness settling over him like a coat he had simply put on. "Show me," he said. They moved together back toward the East Wing, Ji-hoon's pace unhurried despite the urgency in his voice, the particular calm of a man who had long ago learned that panic solved nothing and calculation solved everything. The room, when they reached it, was empty, Choi and the unfamiliar man having vanished in the minutes since Tessa's discovery, though the faint scent of cigarette smoke lingered in the air, evidence enough that the conversation had genuinely occurred. "He'll know I saw something," Tessa said, the fear finally catching up to her now that the immediate danger had passed. "He saw me in the doorway before I ran." "Yes," Ji-hoon said, his voice grave. "He will assume you told me immediately, which means he will consider you a direct threat to whatever he has arranged. You are not safe in this house tonight, Tessa. Not until I have dealt with him properly." "Then deal with him," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice despite the fear still hammering through her chest. "Don't just tell me I'm in danger. Do something about the man who put me there." Something shifted in Ji-hoon's expression, approval threading through the tight line of his jaw, an acknowledgement of the same steel in her that he had first glimpsed the morning she covered his legs with a blanket he had not needed. "I intend to," he said, "tonight. But it means you cannot simply return to your quarters and pretend this did not happen. Stay near me until this is resolved. I will not risk you becoming collateral in something you had no part in creating." She agreed, though the word barely covered the complicated tangle of fear and trust she felt in that moment, and the two of them moved together toward Ji-hoon's private study, where he began making calls in a low, controlled voice that carried the specific weight of a man mobilizing forces most people never saw the shape of. It was nearly midnight when Choi Dae-hyun made his final, desperate move, and the timing, Tessa understood later, had been no accident at all. He had realized his betrayal was already unraveling and decided, in the particular calculus of men who had run out of better options, that eliminating the two witnesses to his treachery was preferable to facing the consequences of exposure. The first sign of trouble was the sudden absence of the estate's usual ambient hum, the security systems that ran constantly in the background of the house falling silent all at once, plunging the study into a darkness broken only by the faint glow of the desk lamp. Ji-hoon was on his feet immediately, positioning himself between Tessa and the door with the same fluid, unhesitating motion she had witnessed in the garden weeks earlier, though this time the stakes were considerably higher than a blanket and a pretend nap. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice utterly flat, utterly controlled, though she could feel the tension coiled through his entire frame, a predator readying itself rather than a man afraid. The study door burst open a heartbeat later, and Choi Dae-hyun stood in the frame with a weapon raised, his expression carrying none of the careful, controlled loyalty he had performed for months as Ji-hoon's trusted lieutenant. "You should have stayed out of this house's business," he said, his eyes fixed on Tessa with a coldness that made her stomach turn. "None of this concerned you. She works in this house," Ji-hoon said, stepping fully between them, his voice carrying a lethal quiet that Tessa had never heard from him before, a register reserved entirely for moments like this one. "Which makes her concern mine, Dae-hyun. You should have considered that before you decided betrayal was worth the risk." Choi's weapon wavered, uncertainty flickering across his expression for the first time, and Tessa, watching from behind Ji-hoon's shoulder, understood in that instant that hesitation was the only opening they were likely to get. She grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the corner table beside her, the only weapon within reach, and threw it hard toward Choi's gun arm the moment his attention shifted fully toward Ji-hoon. The lamp connected solidly, knocking the weapon from Choi's grip a half-second before Ji-hoon closed the remaining distance between them, disarming him completely with the same economical, lethal precision she had glimpsed only in rumor until this exact moment. It was over within seconds, Choi restrained and subdued on the study floor, the entire confrontation resolved with a speed that left Tessa's hands shaking with the delayed shock of what she had just done. Ji-hoon looked at her afterward with something that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, something closer to a full recalibration of everything he had assumed about the woman standing in his study. "You could have stayed back," he said. "You could have simply hidden and let me handle him." "I know," Tessa said, her voice unsteady now that the danger had passed. "I chose to help anyway." "Why?" "Because I've spent my whole life being the person who notices the danger and does something about it," she said, echoing without realizing it the same steady conviction that had carried her across a frozen garden weeks earlier. "I wasn't going to stop being her the one night it actually mattered." Something in Ji-hoon's carefully guarded expression finally broke, the controlled stillness he wore like armor cracking just enough to reveal what lay beneath it. "I told myself, watching you in that garden, that keeping careful distance was the responsible choice," he said quietly, his men arriving now to remove Choi from the room, though neither of them looked away from each other during the exchange. "I have been lying to myself about that ever since." It was not a declaration of love. It was something more dangerous, an honest admission from a man who did not make them easily, and Tessa felt the weight of it settle into her chest alongside the adrenaline and the fear and the strange, fierce certainty that she had no intention of walking away now, not when walking away would mean pretending she had not seen exactly who he was. In the days that followed, the household reorganized itself quietly around the absence of Choi Dae-hyun, his betrayal resolved with the particular finality that men in Ji-hoon's world dealt in, details Tessa did not ask for and suspected she did not want. Her role within the house shifted too, gradually, though neither of them announced the change formally to the rest of the staff. She found herself spending less time with linens and more time simply present in Ji-hoon's orbit, a shift that felt less like promotion and more like gravity finally admitting what it had wanted all along. The remaining staff noticed, of course, the way household staff always notice things they are too discreet to comment on directly. The head housekeeper, a stern older woman named Park Hye-rin who had run this house for over a decade, pulled Tessa aside one afternoon with an expression that carried more warmth than Tessa had expected. "Be careful with him," Park Hye-rin said, not unkindly. "Not because he would hurt you. Because men like him carry more weight than they let anyone see, and the ones who get close to that weight sometimes forget they're allowed to set some of it down themselves." "I'm not trying to fix him," Tessa said. "I just refuse to pretend I don't see him clearly." Park Hye-rin studied her for a long moment before nodding once, a gesture that felt, in its own quiet way, like an unspoken blessing. "Then you will do fine here," she said, "better than most who have tried before you." Word of Choi's betrayal and its resolution moved through the wider organization with the particular speed of underworld gossip, and in its wake came a period of careful realignment, rival factions testing whether the Han organization had been weakened by the loss of a trusted lieutenant or strengthened by how swiftly the wound had been cauterized. Ji-hoon spent long hours in his study during those weeks, meeting with the men who remained loyal to him, rebuilding the structure Choi's treachery had cracked, and Tessa found herself, more often than not, present for at least part of those long evenings, not because her presence was required, but because neither of them seemed willing to end the day without it. There were quieter moments too, ordinary in a way that felt almost startling given everything that surrounded them. He taught her one evening the correct way to hold a cup during a traditional tea preparation, his hands guiding hers with a patience she would not have expected from a man whose reputation suggested nothing but calculation and control. She taught him, in turn, small things about her own life before this house, the sister she still called every Sunday, the mother who had raised her to notice danger before it noticed her, the long road that had led an ordinary young woman from an ordinary life into the orbit of a man the rest of the city spoke of only in careful whispers. "You never asked me why I took this job," she said to him one evening, the two of them seated in the same small library where he had first spoken Seo-yeon's name aloud. "Everyone else who works here seems to have a story about needing the money badly enough to accept the risk." "I assumed as much," Ji-hoon said. "Was I wrong?" "No," Tessa admitted. "But it's not the whole story. I took this job because I wanted to prove to myself I could walk into a dangerous room and still be exactly who I already was. Not smaller. Not more careful than my own instincts wanted to be. I grew up watching women shrink themselves to survive rooms that weren't built for them. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to be one of them. Something in Ji-hoon's expression settled, recognition passing between them the way it had that first frozen morning beneath the cherry tree. You have not shrunk once, he said, since the day I met you. I noticed that before I understood why it mattered so much to me. It was a week later, on another frozen morning in the same garden where it had all begun, that Ji-hoon found her by the cherry tree before dawn, this time making no pretense of sleep at all. I owe you an honest test result, he said, settling onto the bench beside her, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched. You did not simply pass, Tessa. You changed the entire terms of what I believed I was capable of feeling around another person. That sounds like a confession, Ji-hoon, she said, using his given name deliberately now, without hesitation. It is, he said. I do not offer them easily. Consider this one an event. He did not say the word love.
He did not need to.
He reached instead for the blanket she had brought with her out of habit, the same folded wool blanket from that first frozen morning, and draped it deliberately across both their laps this time, an image far more honest than any declaration could have offered. The frost still clung to the hedges around them, the koi pond still skinned over with its delicate lattice of ice, and yet the garden felt entirely different now than it had on that first morning, transformed not by anything visible, but by everything that had passed between them since. Tessa leaned her shoulder against his, feeling the tension he had carried for 8 years loosen by some small, unmistakable degree, and understood that this was not the ending of a story so much as the quiet beginning of one neither of them had expected to want. Park Hyran warned me to be careful with you, she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. She said men like you carry more weight than anyone realizes. She is not wrong, Ji-hoon said. But I find the weight considerably lighter, sitting here with you, than I have found it in 8 years of carrying it alone. Tessa understood, sitting beside him in the cold morning light, that some truths did not require grand pronouncements, only the daily, deliberate choice to remain exactly where you had decided to stand, blanket and all, in a garden that had once been a test and had somehow, gradually, become something closer to home.